Hello and welcome from me, Mike Scott in Oxford, and from Catherine Temple and Joe Simmons in Washington, D.C. This is the 10th event in this new series, which is following on from the Christian Literary Imagination series and our earlier series, Christian Shakespeare question mark, which is now a book being published by Vernon Press and is available. All three series are part of Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. In a moment, I'll introduce today's speaker, Tally Chilson. Your participation is as important as ever, so please type in any questions you have by using your Q&A key at the bottom of your screen. You can do this from the moment we begin the session. We will endeavour to answer your questions and in the discussion that follows. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd just like to say a special welcome to the East End dramatist, novelist, poet, Bernard Copps, who is with us in the audience today. I gather that Bernard is still writing at the age of 97, and we're delighted that you're with us. His memoir of the East End was published in 2006, and his first play, The Hamlet of Stepney Green, which is so well known, was premiered here in Oxford, down at the Playhouse, down the road, in 1957. So Bernard, you're very, very welcome. Now let me go to our speaker for today, Tally Chilson. Tally is a scholar of Hebrew and Jewish literature who has taught at the Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies and also at the Oriental Institute at the University of Oxford, though she's not a member of the university at the moment. And she's done that for over a decade. Since 2012, she's been affiliated with Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Chilson's current research is focused on Anglo-Jewish literature, with particular interest in what she describes as the Anglo-Jewish literary revival. She holds a PhD in Jewish studies from the Hebrew University Jerusalem, and her doctoral thesis was on the Israeli poet Yair Hurwitz, and was turned into a book, A Lonely Bird on a Rooftop, which was published in 2007. In December 2022, I had the privilege of chairing the launch of her new edition of Simon Blumenfeld's 1939 book, They Won't Let You Live, which is about Christians and Jews standing against the disseminating forces of big business in London during the Depression and at the verge of the outbreak of war. And of course, in the context of the fascists and the growth of the fascists, not just in Germany, but also in the UK. Today, Tally turns our attention to the literature that came out of the slum environments that pertained during that period. And I'm delighted to have her speaking to us. So over to you, Tally.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let's start PowerPoint. The authors I should be looking at, first of all, let's start with the title, yes. Parks and Recreation, the Slum and Its Escapes in the Interwar Novels of Jewish London East End Writers. The authors I should be looking at are all London East End born. They are all St. Bernard Copps, son of Dutch Jewish parents, scions of East European Jewish immigrants who settled in the East End at the turn of the 20th century. All of them had to leave school at 14 to earn their upkeep, despite earning a scholarship for the continuation of their education. Their families' meager means could not stretch to support them if they were to complete their secondary education. They started publishing in the mid-1930s, crucially, as Ken Walpole has pointed out, written as it was directly out of experience rather than recollected in maturity. It would be fair to say that there's a good case to consider them as the forefathers of a British Jewish literary revival. And just quickly go over them, Simon Blumenfeld, whose two novels shall be discussed, Jew Boy and Phineas Khan, Ashley Smith, and his book EastEnders, Willie Goldman, East End My Cradle, Charles Paulson, Victoria Park and Scenes from Stepney Youth, Bernard Kopp's poem Diaspora, and if we have time, Arnold Wesker's romanticized view of the East End. Drive me down to the East End, I ordered, is the opening line of Jack London's account of his journey to the East End of London in the summer of 1902. From his book titled People of the Abyss, Jack London, born in 1876 and died in 1916, a passionate advocate of workers' rights, decided to experience at first hand the kind of life London's working class poor were enduring. On arrival in London, he asked his friends where the East End was. To no avail, they simply didn't know. More curious was the fact that his London cabbie did not know either. Jack London remarked on that with astonishment that even the famous first ever travel agency, Thomas Cook, who could easily direct him anywhere in Africa, was at pains to direct him to the East End, a stone throw from their London office. And I would like now to read an excerpt from People of the Abyss. Drive me down to the East End, I ordered, taking my seat. Where, sir? He demanded with frank surprise. To the East End, anywhere, go on. The hansom pursued an aimless way for several minutes, then came to a puzzled stop. The aperture above my head was uncovered, and a cabman peered down perplexedly at me. I say, he said, what place you want to go? East End, I repeated. Not in particular, just drive me around anywhere. But what's the address, sir? See here, I thundered. Drive me down to the East End and at once. It was evident that he did not understand, but he withdrew his head and grumblingly started his horse. Nowhere in the streets of London may one escape the sight of abject poverty, while 5 minutes' walk from almost any point will bring one to a slum. But the region my hansom was now penetrating was one unending slum. The streets were filled with a new and different race of people, short of stature and of wretched or besotted in appearance. We rolled along through miles of brick and squalor, and from each cross street and alley flashed long vistas of bricks and misery. Here and there lurched a drunken man or woman, and the air was obscene with sounds of jungling and squabbling. At the market, tottery old men and women were searching in the garbage, thrown in the mud for rotten potatoes, beans, and vegetables, while little children clusters like flies around the festering mass of fruit, thrusting their arms to their shoulders into the liquid corruption and drawing forth morsels, but partially decayed, which they devoured on the spot. Jack London's account of the working class poor took him to the workhouse, where the unemployed, destitute poor were accommodated and mostly perished due to inhumane conditions, separated from their families and subject to strict rules of separation between men, women, and children. Jack London also offers a detailed description of the process of slumization, pointing out overcrowding as the main culprit. Jack London was not the first to visit and write about the East End. And I'm now going to look at Peter Wilmot's and Michael Young, Family and Kinship in the East End of London, that was published in 1957, which tells us that in 1890, Engels described East End London as the largest working class district in the world. During his century, London expanded from from a city of 1 million people to more than 4 million. And within it, East London was a city inside the city, with boundaries almost as strongly marked as those of some countries. It was a city of the poor. To be poor, especially to be poor en masse, was at times to be a part of the low life, which it was the duty of high-minded, high-collared people to reform. East London used to be darkest London, dark at night for lack of light, dark by day for lack of muscular middle-class Christianity. It would have been a surprise if Dickens had put Fagin anywhere other than Bethnal Green Road, or Morrison chosen anywhere else for his hero than the Jago. The citizens of East End London were there partly because they waited upon the well-off who lived upwind to the west. The poor made clothes and furniture for the rich. Another one of the writers we are considering today is the British Jewish writer Ashley Smith, who gives a description of the East End from his book entitled EastEnders. Unlike the West End, the East End has a precise frontier. It begins at Aldgate Pump. The two regions speak the same language, if with different accents, and obey the same laws. To a large extent, they are unknown to each other. They have the river in common, and without the river, the West End would wither and decay. They differ in that the East End knows the river to carry its life and labor on its tides. The West End does not. This other London must be sought in such places as the Whitechapel Road, in the ceaseless activity, curiosity, and courage of the pavement, and the noise and the vulgarity wherein resides the essence of the Cockney. Many Jewish as well as Cockney faces are to be seen in the Whitechapel Road. East London has its Chinatown and Limehouse, and there is a Scandinavian quarter across the river at Rotherhithe. A blended odor hangs over East London. The blend contains the individual odors of wooden packing cases and dump straw packing, tea, cheese, butter, bacon, rum, and spices, vinegar, and hot humanity. Smith's account describes the East End and the West End of London as two different habitations, that there is more than just a river separating them from each other. A similar approach is reflected in Virginia Woolf's 1933 novel Flush, whereby genteel Wimpole Street in the West End stands in complete contrast to East End's Whitechapel, as focalized by the poet's Elizabeth Barrett's kidnapped dog Flush. Woolf's depiction of the 1846 Whitechapel is that of squalor, deprivation, and violence. East End's Whitechapel was the main area of Jewish settlement from 1881 to 1940. 150,000 Eastern European Jews had arrived in Britain. 65,000 of them settled in the East End. Most of the Jews who settled in Whitechapel lived in a part of that area called Stepney. Stepney was populated by Jews who fled anti-Semitism and pogroms in the Russian empires. They came to Britain having benefited from the open border policy at the turn of the 20th century. In the 1930s, Stepney was overcrowded. When the City of London accommodated 58.7 people per acre, Stepney had 127.5 people per acre. By 1936, 1,766 acres in Stepney were populated by 200,000 people. In 1936, unemployment in London stood on 6.7%. By comparison, it stood on 10.3% in Stepney. The cramped conditions resulted in tuberculosis, pneumonia, and infant mortality far higher than the national average. Let's now move on to Willie Goldman's to move to Willie Goldman, who described the newly arrived Jewish immigrants in his debut 1940 book, East End My Cradle. This version that we will be reading from is a later unpublished revision of the book that was kindly shared with me by Goldman's daughter, Emma Goldman. And I read. They shuffled through the streets looking for shelter and work. What the local Gentiles made of them defeats the imagination. For some, they were friends, relations, or kinsmen who had already settled here and whose written addresses they carried with them in the hope of a safe landing in Newman Harbor. There was also the Russian shelter set up by exiles, immigrants, or Jewish community leaders offering temporary hospitality. The street these people settled in were mean, congested habitations. The houses packed close, 4 to 6 very tiny rooms, the ceiling meeting a man's head, no bath, and an outside lavatory in the small paved yard, back to back and side to side with similar habitations. A broader depiction of the East End comes from the pen of Charles Paulson in his 1976 book, Victoria Park. Right. Amongst the closed little streets and alleys rose the new factories and industrial concerns. Brewing had long been a major activity in Brick Lane, and along Mile End, many of the new manufactories were noisome places, stink industries that would not be tolerated elsewhere than among the now defeated and dispirited East Enders, to whom they offered at least a chance of employment. Dye, glue, chemicals, poisons, mixtures like vitriol. Several described themselves unattractively as blood boilers. The worst of these were probably the sugar refineries, huge high structures where sugar was baked, which gave out a thick and unbreathable effluvium like burning toffee, poisoning the air for miles around. The vast masses of people who inhabited the East End varied in their reaction to their surroundings, as all individuals do. The general standard of physique was extremely low, as must be expected from poor housing and sanitation. Long hours of work in bad condition, 16 hours daily, was not uncommon in some trades. Frequent unemployment, undernourishment, adulterated food, and the ignorance of the illiterate or scarcely educated. It was the outward appearance of the people of East London that caused such revulsion on observers from that different world west of Aldgate Pond. Returning to Willie Goldman, in his 1947 novel, Starting Life, provides us an account of life in such an inhospitable environment. Jenny assumes her mother's housekeeping responsibilities after her mother's untimely death. She quits her job in a workshop in order to look after her father and 2 grown-up brothers. Let's read. In Jenny's workshop days, one of her fondest dreams had been that of spending hot summer afternoons at the park. The dream always came strongest in the busy season. The more deafening the buzz of the machines, the thicker the atmosphere, the more alive was the dream. It was an added nightmare to the nightmare of the workshop itself. In the summer, she escaped into the yard on any pretext just to sniff a breathful of air. The yard was tiny, the lavatory was in continual use, and cat's muck was plentifully sprinkled about. But it was Eden. In fact, on those rare occasions that the boss indulgently allowed the finishing hands to take the tables out in the yard. Jenny was in her element. There was a birdcage on the sill outside the boss's kitchen window, and in it a robin twittered the whole day long. Jenny also sang all day, and she felt an affinity between herself and the robin. They were both prisoners. Prisoners yearn for one thing, their freedom, and that warrants an escape, which takes us to Simon Blumenfeld's first novel, published in 1935, titled Jew Boy. Jew Boy is said to be an autobiographical novel. This novel depicts the life and culture in the contemporary Jewish East End. The protagonist, Alec, is a Jewish native of the East End, born into a family of immigrants from Odessa, then in Tsarist Russia, Ukraine today. Alec is tired of his monotonous life in the sweatshop. He finds one outlet in countryside rambling. The summer months offer weekend rambling opportunities and companionship. Most important for Alec, female companionship. On one such occasion, when Alec is stood up by his girlfriend Sarah, he nevertheless goes on ahead by himself. And let me read from this novel. And the little parish church also was somber and dark, quiet and mysterious looking. The church in whose shadow the Jew Lord Beaconsfield lay buried. His banner hung inside the church above a marble slab set in the wall, inscribed with devoted words of friendship from his queen, Victoria. And all round were evidences of his connections with the church, illuminated parchment, the family pew, the family prayer books, Benjamin Disraeli, Lord Beaconsfield, Jewish patron saint of the Primrose League of die-hard Tories. From the church, it was a hard climb uphill all the way to Hazelmere. The inn was open. He bought a glass of beer and ate his lunch outside on the wooden form. And I skip now. An elderly gentleman in a straw hat faced him on the path. Pardon me, said Alex. I want to get to Hazelmere. Can you show me the quickest way? Yes, indeed, answered the old man. He started on a complicated string of instructions, jabbing the air with his walking stick. Alec kept nodding politely. He knew they would be completely lost after the second stile, but he didn't like to tell him that. The poor old boy was working so hard. At last he stopped and wiped the sweat from his forehead with a trembling handkerchief. Thanks, said Alex. He turned to go, but the old man tapped him lightly on the shoulder with his stick. Are you fond of roses? He asked. What? Are you fond of roses? The old man repeated. I am, said Alec. But what the hell was the old man getting at? If he thought he'd be able to sell him some, he'd made a big mistake. Maybe if Sarah was there, we have a lovely show of roses in the church grounds, some beautiful specimens, the old man said enthusiastically. I'm sorry, said Alec. I haven't much time. I've got to get back to Hazelmere for the High Wycombe bus. Otherwise, I'll miss my coach. The old man waved his stick disparagingly. It'll take no time at all to get to Hazelmere if you go the way I showed you. And we've got a fine old church, too. Dates back from the 12th century. But do look at our roses, just through those gates there. Thanks, said Alec. He was defeated. The old man would make a good out for the lane. Alec nodded to him and went into the churchyard. The old boy was so persistent he didn't have a heart to say no, although he didn't want to be bothered with flowers. Just now, he wasn't in the mood to appreciate them, and he'd already been inside one church today. This would have been the second. Funny when he hadn't been near a synagogue for ages. All of a sudden, this story of an escape to nature appears to be no longer about a countryside excursion for recreational purposes, but instead it is about assimilation, acculturation, and belonging. The former British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, aforementioned in the text, found it difficult to penetrate his newly acquired culture and faith. He had to face in Parliament remarks such as, Jews never make converts. Being accepted was an uphill struggle even for a Christian convert like Disraeli, as expressed here by means of pathetic fallacy. Blumenfeld, being brutally honest as usual, shows that even for him, a British-born and bred Jew, not an immigrant, there is nonetheless a great deal of ambivalence towards the desire to belong and assimilate. Alec stops an elderly gentleman for direction, an information which, as Alec himself observed, he will not be able to retain anyway, highlighting as he goes not being off there, but merely a stranger. The elderly gentleman invites him to a lovely show of roses in the church grounds. Alec, so it seems, gets an invitation to the heart of Englishness, roses being not only the national symbol of England, but also represent ages of cultivation, tradition, and heritage. The same values are represented also by the venue of the Roses Show, a fine 12th century church. Alec shows no real interest in the invitation, but reluctantly accepts it as a matter of courtesy. On another occasion, Alec, missing his parents' home after his father's death and his mother's moving on with her life in the company of a new man, seeks to satisfy his need of belonging in a Yiddish-speaking Jewish restaurant in the East End, with strong ties to his father's hometown of Odessa. Alec misses a homeland he was not a native of, nor he ever visited. The landscape and its beauty engenders sentiments of dislocation and indeed alienation in Bernard Kopp's poem titled Diaspora. Let me read this beautiful poem. Diaspora. How sad that I have found nowhere, that I have found no dream, that I come from nowhere and go nowhere. This is a land without dream, an endless landscape, beautiful for those who can see their own sunset, who can grow their own fruit out of their own sweat, beautiful for those in their own land whose laughter, whose tears soak into their own land, whose songs fill the earth and the sky of their own land. How beautiful to dance and move and live and dream and die in a country with a dream. How sad I am that I have found nowhere. My tears fall into the brick and haste and death of day-to-day existence. This is a country without dream, and no one notices that I'm crying. By the waters of my own falling walls, I wail. I hear the trumpets, see the invisible machines of destruction working in every corner. How sad that I have found nowhere. My son has no festival, his son no ceremony. How sad that the sea beyond does not lift me, nor the hills. The beautiful landscape Koppes feels is not his. His parents were not born in the British Isles, and there's no ancestral heritage associated with that lovely scenery surrounding him. Brian Shyatt observed that this sentiment is also prevalent in the contemporary British Jewish writing by third and fourth generation Jewish writers. Sander Gilman points out the overarching model of Jewish history has been that of center and periphery, or in other words, a homeland and a diaspora. Before 1948, i.e. the foundation of the State of Israel, the center was Palestine as the promised land. After 1948, the promise has been fulfilled in the guise of a nation state, referred to in Kopp's poem as the land of dreams. However, as poets and writers often appear to reside in their native tongue, Copps chooses to think of himself as coming from nowhere and going nowhere, creating thus a modus vivendi of continuous alienation. If nature and its beauty could enhance sentiments of dislocation and alienation, Victoria Park, with its recreational opportunities, was a different matter. Charles Paulson, who dedicated a book-length study to Victoria Park, published in 1976, chronicles the creation of the park in 1840. And I'm reading from it. One of the principal pleasures of life in the East End, not least for the young, was a visit to Victoria Park. This was an area of grassland, sports field, flower beds, lawns, and lakes that covered more than 200 acres of Bethnal Green and Hackney, which had been formed after the building of the open fields in the 1840s. It was constructed at the expense of the government, thus creating a precedent. These matters had up until then been considered the provenance of what was called private benevolence, meaning the whims of the wealthy. But no millionaire came forward to bestow a recreation ground on the overcrowded landless East Enders. Then came the killing outbreak of typhus and cholera, devastating the slums where the masses lived, and these diseases were blown out of the back streets and found their way into the middle-class areas of Bloomsbury and the West End. Albert, Prince Consort, was himself to die of typhoid, which unlikely to have originated in Buckingham Palace or Windsor. So the government listened with sympathy to the petition from the East End and provided the land and the capital. Thus, Victoria Park was made as a kind of a cordon sanitaire that would improve the health of the local people and also help to isolate them from the rest of London. One of Paulson's short stories is dedicated to the writer's boyhood in the park concerned. Boat rides in the park lake, bike rides, feeding the animals in the paddock and the birds in the aviary, appreciating the beauty of the water fountain water spray, reflecting the sun's shimmering rainbow in the mist, and eating pre-packed lunch under a rustic shelter of knobbly tree trunks. There was space there, I'm quoting, level grass stretching away in all directions, edged by tall trees and vast open expanse of sky, quite different from the narrow strips you saw from the streets. But who would look up at the sky in the streets? People would say, "Are you mad?" Victoria Park belonged to the East Enders, Jews included. Jews felt an integral part of their wider working class community, hence strong sense of belonging to Victoria Park. Let's return to Samuel Blumenfeld. Before I go on about his second novel, Phineas Khan, which you can see now, I should mention that all 4 novels have been made available thanks to the labor of love of 2 English writers, John King and Martin Knight of London Books. Most recently, the 4th and final novel, They Won't Let You Live, has returned to shelves. As mentioned, Phineas Khan tells the story of the author's father-in-law and his family. Phineas Khan, the family's patriarch, took to visiting Victoria Park on Saturday mornings, escaping his ever-growing and ever-demanding family under the pretense of attending the obligatory Sabbath morning prayer. And I would like to read a little bit. During the summer days, Phineas was swept by a wave of nostalgia. At home in summer, he had roamed the woods and swum the river and lazed for hours on his back in grassy fields. Here he was tied to the machine Here he was tied to the machine and cutting table, and even when their hold loosened, no less binding were the chains of his wife and children. He went to the synagogue very rarely, but seeing it a chance of escape, he joined the congregation of Bnei Polchuk. Early on Saturday morning, he took his prayer shawl under his arm, ostensibly for a visit to the synagogue, and instead walked to Victoria Park, and there flung himself on the grass and breathed into his shriveled lung the life-giving air. In the stuffy synagogue, the brethren of Polchuk would be swaying ecstatically over the 19th chapter of the book of Numbers. Let me read for you. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, This is the ordinance of the law which the Lord hath commanded, saying, Spake unto the children of Israel, that they bring thee a red heifer without spot, wherein is no blemish, and upon which never came yoke. And you shall give her unto Eleazar the priest, that he may bring her forth without the camp, and one shall slay her before his face. And Eleazar the priest shall take of her blood with his finger, and sprinkle of her blood directly before the tabernacle of the congregation 7 times. And one shall burn the heifer in his sight, her skin, her flesh, and her blood with her dung shall he burn. And the priest shall take cedar wood and his hyssop and scarlet, and cast it into the midst of the burning of the heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, and he shall bathe his flesh in water, and afterwards he shall come into the camp, and the priest shall be unclean until the evening. A gentle wind played on Phinehas' forehead and blew the thick hair over his eyes. He breathed a sign of contentment. Let the Bnei Polchuk worry about the red heifer without spot or blemish. He had enough of his own impeccable red heifers at night. The air from the surrounding trees was more aromatic than either cedar wood or hyssop. He flung out his arms, pressing down into the springy turf, and the sun beat down on his ashen face. Mother Earth, Father Sun, he felt like a pagan worshipper of the elements. Every Saturday morning, he was free for a few hours, free from the cellar, free from the cares of wife and children, in close communion with nature, a child himself again, and not one of the drubbest, most heavily beshackled slaves of the ghetto. Phinehas is feeling nostalgic. The park reminds him of his homeland, his native Russia. Phinehas' enjoyment of the park is tinged with mal de pays. When he otherwise enjoys his newly found freedom, he thinks of his brethren in the synagogue and the reading of that particular Sabbath, namely the passage taken from the book of Numbers, dealing with the ritual of animal sacrifice, and more specifically, the sacrificial slaughtering of a spotless and unblemished red heifer used by the high priest for lustrum. This ritual was regarded as obscure by generation of Jewish scholars. Thinking of that drives Phinehas towards pagan ecstasy, which makes him feel in communion with nature. Being absorbed by nature stands apparently in sharp contrast with the slaughtering of the red heifer. The beauty and pleasure which nature offers are the only constant in a harsh, dislocated life, of which the obscure religious ritual Bible reading can no longer make sense, nor can it offer him, a very religious man, much consolation. When Ashley Smith was commissioned in the late 1950s to write a non-fictional book about the East End, he chose to follow Jack London's example, as he remarked himself, and moved back to the East End, looking for his childhood home, searching for the environment in which he was born and bred was not easy. A lot had changed. There were bomb sites everywhere. Looking down on the East End from the height of the newly built skyscrapers in Stepney and Poplar, he notices the tenement rows looking like children mini block structures, and the gaps in the chains of tenements, the legacy of the Blitz that also destroyed his childhood home and indeed the whole street. What did remain with him was the memory of that vibrant pre-war community with what he called its exuberant social energy. The East End is not vacuous, it's full, choked, and brimming over with mental, emotional, and spiritual values, bitterly struggled for, sought, and achieved. That is why I feel more fully alive in this crowded street than I do anywhere else in the world. That is why I do not feel, as I do in the suburbs, that all links with my fellow humanity are broken as soon as I step 5 yards outside my own front door. That is why I listen with empathy when one of my good friends described his visit to the East End as another pious pilgrimage. Here, the wholeness of man swells to grand proportion within him. It may be said there is nothing here to love, but there is something to worship. Smith lists of achievement of this community. Dr. Bernardo's Home for the Poor Children, founded in Stepney in 1886, spreading later all over England, and the subject of Simon Blumenfeld's third novel, Doctor of the Lost. The Salvation Army, the rent strikes, the National Unemployment Workers Movement, various trade unions, to mention but a few. He fondly reminisces the eager debates and discussions and the buzzing culture hubs like Toynbee Hall and People's Palace. After the war, when skyscrapers replaced the tenements and people living in the new flats were unaware of their next door neighbors and spending their free times watching TV, the culture hubs were replaced by bingo halls. The sense of community is lost, the social energy subsides, and urban alienation takes over. Most of the Jewish community has moved away to the suburb. The East End, as Smith and the others knew it, had gone forever. For Smith, an East Ender by birth, son of immigrants, the East End has become what Vijay Mishra has dubbed the diasporic imaginary. Mishra suggested that the idea of a homeland is often, in fact, a mythologized construction. A place once populated by many Jews, just like the small Jewish township in Eastern Europe of old, the shtetl, a community that was a diaspora, as it consisted of people whose homelands were Russia, Poland, Romania, the Netherlands, and Germany, became by itself a homeland for British Jews of third and fourth generation. As Ruth Gilbert puts it, it is the East End that continues to provide an emotional pull for disoriented contemporary British Jews. We started this excursion with examining how London's urban environment impacted its habitants' well-being, and ended up looking at issues of individual identity, namely dislocation, culturation, and alienation. In 2022, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees announced that we have surpassed the 100 million mark for total displacement, meaning that over 1.2% of global population have been forced to leave their homes. Currently, 32.5 millions are refugees. So I would like to bring this talk to a close by dedicating it to the Holy Father, Pope Francis, and his third encyclical, Fratelli Tutti, of the 4th of October, 2020. And I'm quoting line 95. Love also impels us towards universal communion. No one can mature or find fulfillment by withdrawing from others. By its very nature, love calls for growth in openness and the ability to accept others as part of a continuing adventure that makes every periphery converge in a greater sense of mutual belonging.
Thank you so much for that. What an amazing introduction to a literary arena that I was completely unaware of. I very much appreciate it. Of course, our series is about literature and the environment, but I wanted to start with a more general question, which was, how do you see these works having influenced public attitudes around anti-Semitism, poverty, the East End, at the time they were written or after?
Well, I think, first of all, it's a great historical document because, yeah, and we must remember that those novels were published between the wars, and fascism was already we all remember the cable, we don't remember, but we know about Cable Street, 1936, Mosley trying to march through the East End, and according to Joe Jacobs' book, Out of the Ghetto, the Irish Catholics stood shoulder to shoulder next to the Jewish friends, members of the Union, to stop that happening.
Mm.
And without them, this would have gone on, and Mosley would have marched.
Mhm.
So there's a great example of camaraderie, of community, strong ties of the community, defeating something that was to blight the lives of European for the next 5-6 years.
Mhm.
Yeah, so anti-Semitic, I think I didn't have time to speak about that. That might warrant another session. But the fourth novel deals greatly with this, with the question of anti-Semitism. I think Mike can speak about it because he read it and he joined me. I mean, he presented it in the book launch. This is a great, a poignant document of refuting anti-Semitic ideas and showing and unpicking one trope by another, showing how ludicrous this whole idea of anti-Semitism is.
Mhm.
So that's a very strong document, and it's also a very good read. So I do recommend it great warmly. That's Simon Blumenfield's They Won't Let You Leave. And we're very lucky. So most of those novels just disappeared. They still exist in few libraries,
Mhm.
but the labor of life of love of London Books have put them back on the shelves. So now we have the benefit of being able to read them. I think we mentioned one of them was Mayday of Summerfield. I think Bonnie mentioned it last time in the conference
Mhm.
in December. And that was also came out by London Books. So yeah, we're very lucky that we have a chance now to read them again.
Yeah, I think they're extremely relevant today to issues of immigration and anti-Semitism. We see this rising in the U.S. So absolutely. One thing I thought was fascinating was the idea of intersectionality in these texts, so that you have this population, as you just pointed out, the Irish Catholics protected or stood beside the Jewish population in the East End. And I guess I was wondering, where do you see the primary identity occurring there? Is it as East Enders? Is it as...
That's a very good question. But the answer to it is much more complicated than I could manage in a couple of words. It's a brilliant question. Yes, it's a very complicated, multifaceted identity. all those things that you've mentioned are part of it, and somehow they manage it. It's
Yeah.
being managed. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there's no, I mean, in at least one of the novels you talked about, where the protagonist is supposedly going to temple, but instead goes to the park.
Yeah.
Right. That seems like a
Genghis Khan.
wonderful and almost humorous moment of managing multiple identities, parent, et cetera. So, okay, so I also just wanted to talk about the various environments. You just took us in this presentation through like so many different versions of East End, from the sort of made environments of the factory, even sort of allusions to the home, the street, and also these are still made environments, but the parks, the idea of the roses in the churchyard. And I just guess I wanted to talk a bit about the relationship that this implies between man and nature. All right, so I don't see, natural environments occurring here. They're all sort of made environments, right? Do you think what do you think the relationship is between the humans in these environments and the environments themselves?
Well, I try to show that for the immigrants, the real nature, the landscape, as it were, is engendering very harsh feelings of dislocation. Whilst the domesticated nature in the man-made, as you call it, park, is a much easier thing to deal with, because it's part of your neighborhood, it's part of your environment, it's shared by your community, and therefore, and if you are part of the community, there's no place for feelings of being dislocated or stranger in that park. So there is the juxtaposition of nature and domesticated nature. Yes, you're absolutely right about that.
So it's the wild, right?
Yeah.
I think I read a long time ago that even by 1700 there was no uncultivated land in England, right? So I don't know if that's true or just sort of an 18th century studies urban legend or something. But so basically there's an idea of the wild that is alienating, right? And then there's the domesticated locations that are less alienating.
Yes.
Yeah, that story of Victoria Park I thought was very interesting. It seemed, and I wished you could talk a little bit more about that now, like the evolution of Victoria Park, because it seemed like it was there, but it wasn't available, but then it became available.
No, it was not. It was not there. There was lands that belonged to different neighborhoods neighboring on the East End, which is Hackney and Bethnal Green. Bethnal is part of the East End. There was just unused land that was bought by the government, and the park was built on them purposefully to be a park for the East Enders.
Okay,
so give them some respite, but also to keep them isolated, as I said, as Paulson said, from the rest of London, so there won't be a spread of disease.
Yeah.
The way it used to be. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I do want to open it up to questions.
It's like the environment that you describe, and in the environment of the anti-Semites through history, have been to confine the Jewish people within built environments. They were just moving it here into a park. It seemed far better. But if you read Wesker, for example, he gives the description of the ghetto in Venice, and everybody's looking in on each other. They're not even allowed to look out. They're looking in at each other. Mm-hmm. And they get this amazing thing about the execution of a family where they're executed, they're burned, watching each other, looking at each other. It pushes people away from nature, away from the environment. It's away from God as well, in terms of blocking them out from the rest of society. and this kind of thing that you actually talked about in Victoria Park was a kind of an excuse. It's a relief of conscience, but it's also, as you rightly say, imprisoning them. Don't come out of Victoria Park, we'll die. And the reason why is because the Victoria's husband has died of typhoid. You know, oh, it must be their fault. It's the poor's fault.
Yeah, I
It's
just
a
want to
major
point out it's
social issue. Sorry,
Yeah.
Sally.
Sorry, I just want to point out there's a bit of a difference. The Italian ghetto was indeed imposed on the Jews.
Yeah,
The East End was a different method. It's just Jews gravitated towards their own people in a new and foreign land. So they were escaping pogroms, and they just gravitated towards each other and created this little shtetl, if you wish, in the East End of London.
yes, I understand that. Yeah, yes.
Which was replaced in later years by the Bangladeshi community that had done exactly the same. Gravitated to the same place to have a community of their own. Yeah. No one made them be there. No one forbade them to spread on. But they just wanted to feel better like that.
But to what extent, Tally, though, was that because of the economy?
I think to a greater
Because
extent, yeah. The Docklands are in the East End, so naturally people arrived. That was the first port of call, as it were. But they stayed there because that was the place for poor people to be. Certainly.
yes, yeah, yeah.
I was just going to comment on this, that it seems like the difference, environment's understood as nature, but environment just as what is surrounding you. And the difference between how is your community formed? Is it you're forced into this ghetto space, or is it this is where you naturally gravitate? And the history of the shtetl in Europe of kind of free will association and
Absolutely.
your relationship to the surrounding environment then is going to be very different if it's free will association rather than we're all forced to be here. We don't have a choice, and humans respond differently when they
Absolutely.
feel confined as opposed to freely gathering. So thank you, Tally.
Absolutely.
But Joe, aren't you forced because of the economic situation is forcing you into it?
Yes, I think so.
The only
because-
way you might be forced in terms of the Venetian ghetto because they create it and put you in there.
Yeah.
But that's not the only way that things are created. It's created through forms of capitalism, and with the wealthy creating the factories, pushing the people in. It wasn't just the Jews that had this; it was the Catholics as well. The Irish Catholics got it, and my family going back into the 19th century experienced this in the Black Country in England, where people were forced into certain kinds of community, which then didn't allow you almost to come out, didn't invite you to come out into the society itself. Keep them there.
That
Psychologically clever.
it's very
Psychologically
interesting. And
clever.
that scene about the old man bringing him to the rose garden, right? And the issues of assimilation and the pressure to assimilate that might have represented. Obviously, I haven't read the entire novel, but there just seems to be, there's dual pressures here between a pressure to assimilate, right? And the related and opposite pressure to keep people out, right? And that seems to appear again and again. I was really struck by these images of waste products, as opposed to these images of nature as being more pristine. Pressing your face into the ground might be great at Victoria Park, but not so good in the middle of the street in some of the earlier novels that you talked about. And I wondered if you had worked through, some of the issues around waste, excrement, trash in those novels.
Well, you put your finger on it. You're absolutely right. I think in every piece of text I've read, there was some sort of cleanliness described in very in a lot of details, and it was a place of squalor and disease. Yeah, it was. Yeah, it is part of, it is described in all the novels that I've read of that period. Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay, are there other questions? We did have one question in the Q&A from Sue Osler. And it says initially, this question might not be relevant, but she was very curious about whether Jewish children who lived in the East End were evacuated during the bombing in World War II.
Yes, they were indeed evacuated. And in fact, paradoxically, the conditions of living have improved immensely during the war, as they moved to foster families in the countryside. One of the things that Bernard Kops writes about is that when he was evacuated to the countryside to foster family, it was the first time that he had a toothbrush. So and he writes about it in his autobiography, The World is a Wedding, another very recommended book, brilliant book. So yes, they were evacuated. Sometimes they turned backwards and went back to the 41 was a very bad year of Blitz. So yes, they were evacuated, and they went to Christian families who treated them beautifully and kept their own religion going. And so yeah, that was happening.
I think that's exactly what I was interested in, whether they, experienced, a positive result from evacuation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, well, unless there are other questions or comments from Mike or Joe, we're past the hour, and I know that Michael has some things to say about the programming, so I will turn it back over to him.
Well, thank you, Tali, for a great talk. Thank you, Catherine, for really great conversation, and you, Joe, and raising really big issues here. And they are issues to do with literature and the environment. The environment isn't just to do with the natural environment; it's to do with the built environment. And so I found it really fascinating. Our next event in this series is on Tuesday, the 14th of March, when Claire Broom Saunders, who was supposed to be coming to the US to give this talk on the 14th of March, but certain technicalities have occurred, which means she can't come until later in the year, but she's still going to give a talk for us, and that's on the 14th of March, and she'll be discussing Fabiana Tracquair, Dante, and William Blake, all the unapproachable beauty in nature's details. So that's on the 14th of March. Blake, Dante, and Tracquair. So I look forward to that. Would you note, though, that although this is at 11 a.m. in the US, it will actually be at 3 p.m. in the UK, because we put our clocks forward 2 weeks later in the UK than you do in the US. So we get this kind of, it's only a 4-hour difference. So that's on the 14th of March. On Wednesday, March the 22nd, there's a Zoom which you might like to note, which is on the Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues. And this will again actually link up with this talk today, because it is on democracy and Israel. And note again that it's at 3 p.m. in the UK, although 11 a.m. in the USA. All events after March the 26th will be back at the normal times. So we have this kind of anomaly, causes us problems each year. For today, I'd like to thank those at Georgetown University who made all these events happen, especially Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. And at Georgetown, also to Jack DeJoy, the president, and Tom Banchoff, the vice president, global affairs. Without their support, these wouldn't occur. At Campion Hall, to Nick in the master, and to Ying Ying, our administrator. At Blackfriars, Richard Finn, director of Las Casas Institute, and John O'Connor, the regent. My thanks as ever to Maggie Scott, my wife, for helping with the administration. So don't forget to join us at our next free speech session on Wednesday, the 22nd of March, 11 a.m. EST, 3 p.m. in the UK, and the next Bent but Beautiful Work event on Tuesday, the 14th of March at 11. Oh, I don't know what the time will be actually. Yes, it will. It will be 11 a.m. EST and 3 p.m. In the UK. That's the Bent but Beautiful World, 14th of March. In the meantime, Tally, thank you very much for a very learned and an interesting session. And thank you both, Catherine and Joe, for the conversation afterwards. And thank you all for joining. Bye bye.